Now, they are all accused of depriving George Floyd of his civil rights on May 25th of 2020 when he was placed under arrest after trying to pass a counterfeit $20 bill at Cup Foods on 38th in Chicago here in Minneapolis. Derek Chauvin, of course, the fourth police officer on the scene that day, has already pleaded guilty in this civil rights case. And of course, he's also now in prison for the death of George Floyd. Rob Olson has been in federal court in St. Paul for the duration of this trial. He joins us now live. And Rob, everyone back in the courthouse today after taking a 3-day break. Judge Magnuson kind of had to put the trial on pause last week because of COVID. Fill in the gaps for us here, if you could.
Yeah, Tim, that was on Wednesday morning when everybody was in court set to resume, except for one of the three officers. Again, don't know who tested positive, but former officer Thomas Lane was the one who was not in the courtroom. The other two were. The attorneys all were when we were notified that one of the defendants had tested positive for COVID-19. And they routinely do checks here, running tests on everybody.
Control room, I cannot hear Rob's audio.
That we would take a break until Monday. So there was calling off court on Wednesday morning, then no court on Thursday or Friday to resume again this morning. And this morning resumed as scheduled, and the judge saying that everybody had tested negative and we were once again good to go. Of course, Judge Magnuson here been very careful about COVID-19 precautions and protocols, very concerned about not wanting anything to interrupt or delay or even have to cause any sort of shutdown of this trial because of, there's so much time and invested in this, and effort invested in this in terms of the preparations and security, witnesses, the jury, the interruption to their lives. So certainly not wanting to take any problems or having any issues with that, but also not wanting to prolong this trial any longer than need be either. But so that was a unfortunate break that needed to occur to make sure everybody was healthy and able to resume, but certainly something the judge was not happy about having to do, preferring to not have to do that at all, that there would be no problems. But again, everything back on today with the out-of-town, out-of-state witness that was set to start testifying on Wednesday, who had to fly back and now has started testifying today.
And of course, his name, Dr. David Systrom. He's a pulmonologist from the Boston area. He's on the medical faculty at the Harvard Medical School. And basically, he was brought in as an expert witness on kind of backing up what the pathology report came from the medical examiner here in Hennepin County.
Yeah, and very similar, pretty much serving the same function as the expert witness Dr. Tobin did in the Derek Chauvin murder trial. In this case, Dr. Systrom talking about the effects of asphyxiation, about blood oxygen levels, and what he found to be the causes of that, the cause of George Floyd's death, which is ruled cardiopulmonary arrest, which means the heart and the lungs stop functioning. And so what he was explaining to the jury, and again, a lot of this at the beginning was a lot of basically a mini medical school about how the heart and the lungs function, how the oxygen goes into the bloodstream, how it is circulated, and what happens when oxygen levels in the blood drop, how they drop. And in this case, primarily because of Derek Chauvin's knee on George Floyd's neck, which restricted George Floyd's airway, the trachea in the neck, which he testified is about the size of a quarter in diameter, and believes that the pressure exerted here probably reduced that by half or so, maybe a little bit more. And that immediately then lowers the amount of oxygen he can breathe in. When you combine that with the prone position, that is lying face down, stomach down on the pavement, with then more restraint on your back, that they had a diagram and animation showing the bellows function of the lungs and the way it expands the chest cavity and the ribs and the diaphragm, and how then being face down with pressure on your back means you can't expand your lungs as much. So not only are you taking in less air and oxygen, your lungs can't also expand that much, and that rapidly then lowers the blood oxygen level and at the same time then increases the carbon dioxide levels in the blood, which leads to this what's called acidosis, basically acidic conditions, more acid in the bloodstream and in the tissues, and specifically tissues of the heart, and then that leads to arrhythmia, an abnormal heart rhythm. So they kept coming back to that. That was the theme. Low oxygen, high carbon dioxide, because of inhibited breathing, which then leads to loss of consciousness and this heart arrhythmia, a rhythm that cannot be shocked back into a normal rhythm as you would do with a heart attack or cardiac arrest.
And Rob, Dr. Systrom made a point of also pointing out to the jury that his death was caused by this arrhythmia brought on by the asphyxiation and not necessarily a cardiac arrest brought on by heart disease, which is a very important distinction.
Yeah, they talked about, the autopsy findings that George Floyd had an enlarged heart and that there were some, what he called occlusions in his arteries, in his heart, some blockages essentially. So when you have a heart attack, you have plaque buildup in those arteries, and then you have something that breaks off and causes, when they say sudden cardiac arrest, it's acute arrest because there's a sudden, quick, instant blockage in an artery in your heart caused by something breaking off and a clot, essentially, a clog. He said that was not the case here, that the enlarged heart, which is typical for somebody with high blood pressure, but those did not come into play here, that there was no blockage caused by his condition of his heart. It was an arrhythmia caused by the buildup of acid because of low oxygen and high carbon dioxide. And that alone, the condition of his heart, would not have killed him on that day.
And Rob, I thought some of the most important testimony for the prosecution came right before the break here when Dr. Systrom was testifying that if George Floyd would have been repositioned before he lost consciousness, his chances of recovery would have been substantial, correct?
Substantial is a good way to say it, too. He was asked very directly by the prosecution that prior to him losing consciousness, and the doctor, too, went through that this was, the sign of lowering oxygen levels in the blood, that he slows down, before losing consciousness. But his breathing rate remained 22 to 24 breaths per minute, which is elevated. And that's another point, too, not to go on another tangent here, but they were asking about the use of fentanyl and, in his system, and that fentanyl typically slows breathing. They use it with people who are suffering a shortness of breath with terminally ill patients, that it can slow their breathing and reduce their feeling of a shortness of breath. So George Floyd's breathing rate was actually elevated, so they said that didn't have an effect. But prior to losing consciousness, he was asked very directly, had pressure been removed from his neck with the knee, or had he been moved to a sitting position, even still handcuffed? Would he have recovered? And he said, yes, your oxygen levels recover rapidly. Your carbon dioxide levels go down very rapidly. So prior to losing consciousness, had that asphyxia, had that compression stopped, had he been moved to a different position, not laying face down, he said he would have recovered very rapidly and likely not then have gone into a heart arrhythmia.
And the chances of him surviving, had they started conducting CPR, I understand, was also part of the testimony.
Yeah, and so then asked too at the point then he loses consciousness, and he testified that he believes the heart arrhythmia, that abnormal heart rhythm, was simultaneous to the instant that he lost consciousness. And so asked again, then after that, at that point, had CPR been begun immediately at that point, what would that have done to his chances of survival? And he said doubled, perhaps tripled his chances had that medical attention been given immediately after losing consciousness, immediately after going into that arrhythmia.
All right, I want to remind our viewers that we're watching the live stream here with our colleague Rob Olson, who's been in the federal trial, this federal civil rights trial in federal court in St. Paul for Thomas Lang, Tu Tao, and J. Alexander King. We're in the middle of a lunch break right now. They broke about 20 minutes ago. They're going to be coming back at 2 o'clock this afternoon. Rob, is the prosecution going to continue with its questioning then, or is he wrapped up?
Well, the prosecution said that they were done with the final questions about his survival rate. And then the prosecution also asked too, since the charges here are constitutional violations of failing to intervene with the use of force, but failing to provide medical aid. And so that's really what they were getting at here at the end. And she asked, did you see any of the officers give any sort of medical aid prior to George Floyd being loaded into the ambulance? And he said, no, I saw none. With that line of questioning, then the prosecution finished. We've taken the lunch break until 2, and then the defense gets their crack at going after some of these, cross-examination of some of these things that he testified to. Obviously, the use of having fentanyl in his system, excited delirium, that controversial topic about elevated kind of hysteria, and will come up in questioning probably. That was addressed a little bit by the prosecution, not by name. They didn't use that term, but said, asked about some of his conditions and would having an extra adrenaline in the system cause that arrhythmia, and he said no. So no doubt, though, they will ask him specifically about some of these other things that, they'll try to see if they can poke any holes in his testimony about what did and did not cause George Floyd's death when we resume at 2.
And part of the testimony, I understand, under questioning from, is it Samantha Triple? She's still conducting the questioning on behalf of the federal government, Rob?
No, it was a different assistant U.S. attorney here, Sertich.
But under questioning this morning, it's my understanding that Dr. Systrom basically said where both Tom Lang and J. Alexander King had their hands positioned on the body may have prevented George Floyd from rolling over, which could have contributed to him being still in that prone position. And that's a key part of the testimony for the prosecution.
Yeah, and they were showing still frames from some of the body camera videos of the former officers, and specifically with J. Alexander King, who was holding George Floyd's left wrist behind his back, and about how that would have impeded his ability to reposition to give his lungs and his rib cage more room to expand. So they asked about that. They also asked about, and this came up in Derek Chauvin's murder trial too, where you can see George Floyd's right hand and knuckles on the pavement and against the squad car tire. And they noted he had abrasions on his knuckles, and that it would have come from the pavement and the squad car. And this doctor, just as the doctor did in the Chauvin murder trial, testified that was, in his view, an effort to kind of push himself to relieve the pressure on at least one side of the right side of his chest, to allow deeper breathing, more lung expansion. And so I would expect that will also come up in the cross-examination, specifically from King's defense attorney. Thomas Lane was holding George Floyd's legs down at the back, and the doctor testified that would not have inhibited his breathing. It would have constricted his lungs or his airway as the actions of the other 2 former officers did. But certainly that would have prevented him from moving into a position that he could have taken in more oxygen. It didn't, like I said, didn't constrict his airways, but would have prevented him from repositioning in a way that he could have.
All right. Rob Olson coming to us from federal court in St. Paul. Thanks, Rob. I know court's going to be getting back into session here in about another 50 minutes, so we're going to let you go grab some lunch here before the afternoon session starts again with Dr. David Systrom, still on the stand, expert witness on behalf of the prosecution here, in this case, the federal government. We're going to have a complete wrap-up tonight on Fox 9 News at 5 o'clock, and we'll be back here on the stream again on fox9.com and on our YouTube channel at approximately approximately the same time tomorrow. It varies, give or take, by 10 or 15 minutes, depending upon how testimony is proceeding in court in the morning and when Judge Magnuson wants to take a break. But we'll be back here at approximately the same time tomorrow. In the meantime, thanks so much for joining us. We'll have a wrap-up tonight here on Fox 9 News. On behalf of everyone here at Fox 9, I'm Tim Blotz. Have a great afternoon, everyone.